Hello, you fucks. Welcome to John Solo's Beer Brigade. I'm John Solo, and this here is another Storytime episode. Today we have this one up here. Baby and the Warrior. This is Shifter Rescue Book 4 by Victoria Sue, our other favorite Brit. We love Victoria Sue around here, and this book is no exception. Pardon me for a second.
Paying us.
It's like my Mentos ad. Anyways, we are just dead pretty close to the middle of the book, working away, and we finally ran into... See, normally what I try and do in story time is like the meet cute thing, but, well, they met in the last book, so we can't really use that for the story time this time around. So I had to wait for them to kind of get back together again. So we're at chapter 5 in this, so be aware... I don't think there's really any spoilers, but I mean, at this point, this is the 4th book in the series. You should be caught up by now. And there are a lot of characters from the previous books. They're it's a Shifter Omega verse pack. You should probably listen to the series, I guess is what I'm saying. Let me pull up the blurb here and tell you what you're getting into. What could it take to simply give up? Barely nothing. Matthew Red Carter's life had been over since his mate had returned to be the tiger prince he was born to be. The mate Red could never measure up to. His life had been over since he was 17, and Bodhi's was a bright spark that was just beginning. It would have been simple, had Bodhi agreed. But Bodhi had other ideas. What would it take to simply fall in love? There we go. This is going to be chapter 5. Remember, this is a live recording session. If you haven't seen one of these before, you're a fly on the wall. Not really. That'd be kind of weird. You'd be like, bzz, 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 and I don't think you're like that. But you're going to hear mistakes. Tracy's going to jump in. She'll do corrections and all that. I'm not really paying any attention to the camera, so just be aware. It's just kind of like you get to watch a live recording session, because that's exactly what you're doing. So enjoy, have fun. I will see you all in the next one. Peace. Chapter 5. Red watched silently as Jonas relaxed. Zeke showed him all the controls and answered every question. No one seemed surprised after 40 minutes, when he fell asleep. Riker turned to Red, one eyebrow raised. Red sighed. He knew the questions would start as soon as Jonas couldn't hear, and judging from the soft snores, he was out like a light. Before I tell you, Red's throat closed. He didn't dare ask. Mating sickness. Red's heart jolted, and he almost rubbed his chest. That's why he's here. I never touched him. That was impossible. And if true, it meant he was forced to be here, not that he wanted to be, and a tiny bit of hope he clung to died. Adya, is that right?
Yes.
Be here, not that he wanted to be, and a tiny bit of hope he clung to. Why did I cut off died? There. To be, and a tiny bit of hope he clung to died. Adya came a few days ago to see you. Bodhi's sick. He's not eating. None of the pack or Khan could get him to imprint, and no tiger shifters were suitable for a mate. Fury boiled under Red's skin at just the thought of another's hands on him. What do you mean, suitable? He finally ground out. I don't exactly know, but apparently they're wise. Wise one. Suitable, he finally ground out. I don't exactly know, but apparently their wise one said if he didn't mate with you, he would die. Red's gaze turned unseeing to the small window. I'm surprised the Khan didn't prefer that. No, you're not, Riker immediately disputed. He wants what every dad wants for their kid, with the exception of mine. Just because we grew up with assholes for fathers doesn't make. With the exception of mine. See, that's an inside thought bubble inside of a paragraph where Riker is talking from Red, I think.
Right. Yes.
Immediately
Riker,
disputed.
then Red, then Riker.
He wants what every dad wants for their kid, with the exception of mine. Just because we grew up with assholes for fathers doesn't make that the same for everyone, Riker added. We didn't Assholes for fathers doesn't make that the same for everyone, Riker added. He didn't reject Bodhi, Zeke put in. His son was kidnapped. Not knowing of Emmett's existence was bad enough, but I can't imagine what I would have done if I'd have known and couldn't find him. Reject Bodie, Zeke put in. His son was kidnapped. Not knowing of Emmett's existence was bad enough, but I can't imagine what I would have done if I'd have known and couldn't find him. So, they'd relented to save his life. Red rubbed at his bare arm. His wolf paced in his head. The need for his animal was almost choking, and Red clamped down hard on
The need from his animal.
Did you also think that it was weird that he rubbed his bare arm, but he's a wolf? Red rubbed at his bare arm. His wolf paced in his head. The need from his animal was almost choking, and Red clamped down hard on the urge to let the animal free. His wolf wanted his mate. Simple as that. It was the human side of him that was fucked up, so they would mate. Then what? He wasn't joining some high and mighty tiger clan. Con. The human side of him that was fucked up, so they would mate. We have our own member group. Is my name a different color? Am I a member of the member group? The human side of him that was fucked up, so they would mate. Then what? He wasn't joining some high and mighty tiger con. Liar. He would do whatever Bodie needed. He knew that. He should be sitting here fucking thanking his lucky stars he was getting another chance, not feeling sorry for himself. Red didn't do love. He knew his mom had loved him, but fear had seemed to overpower all other emotions. Fear and shame. And he supposed Dean had simply forgotten him. He'd moved on anyway. The one time his mom had stuck up for herself had been when Dean was threatened physically. He had heard Dean crying as he got into the house, and had to fight his way past the betas until he got to where his mom's broken, dead body lay. His dad had insisted it had been an accident. Everyone knew how awkward, how clumsy she was. The alpha was heartbroken, but he had to pull the pack together for the sake of his sons and carry on. The betas nodded and believed him. At least whatever they thought they kept private. No one would challenge him publicly, as if it was the fastest way to die. The only wolf that could challenge his dad was another alpha.
As it was the fastest way to die.
Thought they kept private. No one would challenge him publicly, as it was the fastest way to die. The only wolf that could challenge his dad was another alpha, or the alpha heir. So, he did. Minutes later, beaten, bloody, but now the alpha, at only 17, he had managed to shift back just as Dean had run at him, crying hysterically, beating him with his small fists, screaming he had killed his dad, that he hated him. The she-wolves had all looked at him with a mixture of resentment and shock, and led Dean away. The betas wouldn't look him in the face. Technically, he was the alpha, but in that second, he knew he couldn't stay. Not one of them would support him. They would obey him, but he doubted he would last a week before another alpha challenged him. So, he did the only thing he could, and left. Maybe we should talk about your new friend. And in the midst of wading through utter shit, Red looked at his oldest friend and almost wanted to laugh at the question. He'd essentially kidnapped a human child and was bringing him into a shifter pack. He might not even be able to stay there himself once he found out what Bodie needed. Red told them both what had happened, including the bombshell at the end where he'd been seen. The trouble is, unless this can be substantiated, happened, including the bombshell at the end where he'd been seen. The trouble is, unless this can be substantiated, they can argue the trauma he's just gone through would upset any child and cause him to lash out at the creepy husband, Zeke said. Plus, from what you said, it sounds like Grandma's got a good local reputation. I promised, Red said stubbornly and folded his arms. And what about... Riker. I promised, Red said stubbornly and folded his arms. And what about the Omegas? Red knew what Riker was saying, that it wasn't fair for the pregnant ones to stay out of sight all the time. He knew he was putting everyone at risk. He looked at Zeke. Ideas? No legal ones, Zeke said. I mean, getting a new identity is relatively straightforward, as we've done that before, but that's for shifters, ones that can stay off the grid. How do we know that Grandma won't call the cops? She would have to, Riker agreed. I wonder how convenient it would be to have him disappear, though. I'd like to know why she had a security guard walking the house. Me too. He could understand alarms, but guards? Can we find out? Red asked. You think she's into something? Riker nodded. But that still doesn't address the problem of the Omegas, or the Cubs. They might not be careful what they say. He glanced at Red. Should put the stress on they. But that still doesn't address the problem of the Omegas, or the Cubs. They might not be careful what they say. He glanced at Red. You don't even know where you will be. They met each other's gaze, and Red nodded. He knew if he was all in with Bodhi, then Bodhi would come first. If. Red nearly scoffed. He had been all in with him since the day he had seen him in that field and wanted to rip Bodhi's supposed uncle a new one for laying his hands on him, even though he'd thought he was human. Thought his scent was lying.
Stop. Even when.
And wanted to rip Bodhi's supposed uncle a new one for laying his hands on him. It's back cut. And wanted to rip Bodhi's supposed uncle a new one for laying his hands on him, even when he'd thought he was human. Thought his scent was lying. Don't you have an FBI contact? Zeke asked. Daniel? Riker brightened. He's some ways away, but... Zeke asked. Daniel? Riker brightened. He's some ways away, but he might be able to help. Daniel, Reg queried. How come I've never heard of him? He lives out in Montana, not exactly local. He's close to a family of bear shifters that run the equivalent of a foster home for shifter kids. I met him around 5 months ago when the Shifter Council contacted us. Can you reach out? Red asked. I'll take Jonas back with me tonight. Zeke? Out? Red asked. I'll take Jonas back with me tonight, Zeke said immediately. The house is pretty private, and Daryl and Selena will get him settled. He smiled to himself. I don't think Caden's likely to shift anytime soon. Will Caden ever shift? Red asked suddenly. Zeke was human and Daryl an Omega. Zeke grinned. Who knows? I mean, technically, I wasn't supposed to be able to get Daryl pregnant. Red couldn't help but smile. He could almost see Zeke puffing his chest out. You the man. Help the smile. He could almost see Zeke puffing his chest out. You the man, Riker teased. I'm going to be landing in 20 minutes, Zeke said. Does Jonas know what to expect? I just told him I have friends who live here. Nothing else. There was a brief silence, and Red scrubbed a tired hand over his face. I couldn't leave him. The kid would run, was running. It was sheer luck I saw him. Instincts had made him return, but it was a complete coincidence Jonas had chosen that moment to shimmy down the drainpipe. He didn't like thinking about where he might have ended up. At least Red had claws and teeth for weapons and fur to keep him warm. Humans were too fragile, which made him think of something else immediately. To distract himself, he woke Genesis. Too fragile, which made him think of something else immediately. To distract himself, he woke Jonas as gently as he could and explained he was going to stay with Zeke and Daryl because they had space, but that Red would see him in the morning. Jonas wasn't thrilled, but Zeke was good. Daryl because they had space, but that Red would see him in the morning. Jonas wasn't thrilled, but Zeke was good with him and asked him if he had ever played on a PlayStation 5. Jonas's eyes rounded immediately, and Riker hid his grin. Red was just grateful. Now that Jonas was taken care of, his other needs battered him. He was desperate to get out and make sure Bodhi was safe. Well, Red turned to look out the window again. safe, well, grateful. Now that Jonas was taken care of, his other needs battered him. He was desperate to get out and make sure Bodhi was safe, well. Red turned to look out of the window again as they crested the forest leading to the pack house, and for a moment an overwhelming urge to see his mate made him tremble as he waged a war with his wolf. His wolf was just as much an alpha as he was, and the animal was pissed. "Just so you know, I've told his guards about you." "Guards?" Red was startled. "Bodyguards?" Riker spread his hands like he had no choice. Red frowned. He would see about that. He managed to keep it together while they landed and promised to see Jonas in the morning before Dario led the boy away. He left Zeke to see the chopper and followed Riker. Emmett
Stop.
flew
He left Zeke to see to the chopper.
while they landed and promised to see Jonas in the morning before Dario led the boy away. He left Zeke to see to the chopper and followed Riker. Emmett flew out of the door and launched himself at Riker, but Red didn't stop. The second he had touched down, he'd known exactly where he would find Bodhi. He could feel him under his skin and in every cell. Their minds brushed, and Red's wolf stilled completely, shocked at the unusual reaction. It was like the animal held his breath. He ignored the greetings he got as he headed for his room, ignored the obvious tiger shifter standing 6 feet away, but paused as his hand flattened against the wooden door. He closed his eyes and rested his forehead against it. Bodhi was in there. Awareness settled over him, and his hand moved of its own accord to open the door. He stepped inside, his gaze landing on the curled-up figure in the bed. He could feel Bodhi's tiger circling his wolf, the desire they had for each other, the understanding, the knowledge they were meant to be together. It was again the human side of him that complicated matters. He stood barely breathing and watched his mate sleep. A giant fist seemed to clutch his heart as he took in the pale skin, the black shadows under each closed eye and the sunken cheeks. Human soft, he had called him to Riker, and he was... the black shadows under each closed eye and the sunken cheeks. Human soft, he had called him to Riker, and he still was, but there wasn't an ounce of spare fat on him now. He looked starved. The urge to fix that was just as powerful as the urge to be close to him. Luckily, his brain kicked in. He was filthy, and he wasn't about to touch his mate like this. His wolf was distracted enough by the tiger to ignore him, so he closed the door quietly and headed for the shower. His clothes were only good for burning, so he tossed them aside and climbed in the shower. He closed his eyes, his head filled with... Clothes were only good for burning, so he tossed them aside and climbed in the shower. He closed his eyes. His head was filled with soft skin, delicate shoulders, and bruises where there should have been laugh lines. More than anything, he wanted to make Bodhi happy. Guilt settled heavily in his gut. While he'd been off playing wild animal, Bodhi had been suffering. But no longer. He would make sure that shy smile graced his face every day. Make sure he was safe, but most of all, make sure he belonged to him. He'd gone, he'd done it once, but there would be no repeat. Bodhi was his, all his. Red would spend the rest of his life making sure Bodhi was safe and happy, that Bodhi would never be in any doubt he belonged to him. He let himself out of the bathroom, naked, to see Bodhi had rolled over, facing away from him. He crept to the bed and slid under the comforter, touching the cold skin huddled there. Bodhi was freezing, and Red frowned, immediately plastering himself to his omega's length. Bodhi stirred immediately as Red wrapped his arm around him and pulled him snug to his body. Red gasped as heat raced through every cell, flooding his mind with scent and touch and... fuck, so much need as everything in him seemed to come alive at once. Bodhi went in an instant from something to be cherished and protected to something needing to be ravished and possessed. Fuck you, loud car. To something needing to be ravished and possessed. Flames licked at Red's skin. His cock throbbed and swelled, hardening almost instantly to the point of pain. His body felt too tight under his skin, and a groan escaped his lips. Bodhi turned in his arms, opening his eyes, and Red met his gaze. No words were needed as Red lowered his lips. The instant their mouths touched, electricity jumped and arced between them. He plunged his tongue into Bodhi's willing mouth and gathered him up tight, the firestorm raging around them. He tasted so perfect, and Red wanted to spend all the time he had left getting to know the one he was crushing to him. His. Bodhi was all his. Every single inch, every thought, every hope, every dream. He was touching him everywhere. Need rose in him so swiftly it robbed him of his breath and his sanity. He wanted to bite Bodhi all over, fuck him until only Red knew his name, possess him, shield him against the world. He wrenched his mouth away, knowing they both needed oxygen. "You're mine." He wrenched his mouth away, knowing they both needed oxygen. "You're mine." It wasn't a question. He was done fucking about. He didn't care if Bodhi was a prince, a different species. He didn't care if he was a fucking alien. Bodhi was his. He vaguely heard the incoherent noises of agreement spilling from Bodhi's lips before Red reached down and found him leaking. His own cock jumped at the feel and the smell, and he wanted nothing more than to bury himself in all that perfection. But his brain kicked into gear. He didn't need to ask Bodhi if it was his first time, and he would kill anyone that hurt what was his. Even with his sex-addled brain, he knew the biggest threat to Bodhi right that moment.
He knew that the biggest threat.
He knew the one that hurt what was his. Even with his sex-addled brain, he knew that the biggest threat to Bodhi right that moment was Red. So he was going to take it slow. He had all night. And the rest of their lives. Red shuffled down a little, hearing the gasp from his mate, feeling the squirm, the hands that tried to stop him from going any lower. Some nonsense about it being hours since he had showered, as if his mate was something less than utter perfection. He pinned Bodhi still, careful not to hurt, but dominance was his middle name, and holding Bodhi down called to everything inside him. Bodhi's eyes grew huge, until Red closed his lips around Bodhi's shaft, and his eyes rolled upwards, fingers clenching the sheet he was lying on, murmuring incoherent, greedy noises that spilled helplessly from Bodhi's throat. Bodhi's cock swelled and pulsed immediately. Red ignored the breathless warning, and sucked and laved, reveling in the addictive taste, and too soon swallowed everything down until his mate was simply a limp noodle in his arms. Red wasn't, but he could wait. They had a lifetime to explore possibilities, his taste, and the endless ways he wanted to bring them both pleasure. Bodhi seemed to stir after a few moments, and opened his eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just let Red drink him in. "Should we talk?" Red nodded and dropped a kiss on that upturned mouth, because he was so adorable, and he belonged to him. "Absolutely. But not tonight." He nuzzled behind Bodhi's ear, and was gratified when Bodhi moaned. He even felt Bodhi's cock give a valiant twitch, and smiled to himself. "Turn over." Bodhi stared at him for a second, but then complied, which had Red's cock jerking at the show of obedience and the trust that lay beneath that. He stifled his own groan and reached for the bottle of lotion at the back of his drawer. It doubled as slick if he needed it, but this stuff was actually expensive, and his one indulgence. He loved the thought of decorating Bodhi's skin. The faint scent of almond and pine would mix with the sweet scent of cinnamon and raspberry that came naturally to him. Who had cinnamon?
Bingo!
Raspberry that came naturally to him. Red clicked open the bottle and warmed it in his hand, then started on Bodhi's shoulders, smoothing out down his arms. He'd thought his body might get a chance to calm, but the indecent noises that Bodhi made unconsciously kept Red hard and aching. By the time he had gotten to Bodhi's waist, Red was rocking into him, desperate for some friction for his aching cock. He smoothed the lotion over Bodhi's ass and trailed a finger down his crease. Bodhi whimpered and shifted. Red didn't imagine Bodhi realized what an utter delight he was. Every thought showed on his face. Every reaction drew a sound from his throat. Red wanted to make him sing for hours, but doubted he had the stamina this time to make it happen. Bodhi moaned again and rocked as if the pressure from lying on his now hardened cock was too much. "Roll over," Red demanded breathlessly, and Bodhi did. Red took him in. Flushed features, plump, swollen lips, dazed eyes. He was utterly beautiful. More so because he was his. Red debated his options. They wanted nothing more than to be inside him. But Red wasn't small, and he didn't want to cause him pain. He slicked his hand up with some more lotion and wrapped it around Bodhi's length. The gasp was satisfying, but Red swallowed the cry that followed it. He took his own cock in his hand, lined them both up, and let himself drown in the noises pouring from his mate. In his head he sensed the animals prowl around each other. Bodhi's tiger was glorious, sleek and powerful. His mate might be like a kitten, but his animal was all jungle cat. The alpha wolf inside him craved dominance, but knew it would have to be granted, not taken. But knew it would have to be granted, not taken. Him craved dominance, but knew it would have to be granted, not taken. Red firmed his grip, and his fingers tightened around both their lengths. It would take nothing for him to explode, but he was determined to get Bodhi off a second time. He deployed every trick he knew. The twists, the glides, the pumping, and then the smoothing of his palm over both engorged heads. He felt Bodhi's shudders, the swelling and throbbing of his cock under Red's fingers. His whole body tightened in preparation, and both their animals stilled. He had a brief moment of surprise when he recognized his wolf's demand and ignored him. He knew the bite could only happen after penetration, and the alpha wolf would just have to wait. Red just managed to hold off. Then he belched. Could only happen after penetration, and the alpha wolf would just have to wait. Red just managed to hold off before Bodhi tipped over the edge a second time, his cries an absolute gift to hear before he followed him. Sometime later, he woke, vaguely remembering staggering out of bed earlier to fetch a warm cloth to tend to Bodhi in the seconds before he realized what had woken him, and he groaned in pleasure. He felt the answering vibration in his length, because it was currently encased in Bodhi's mouth. Opening his eyes, he met the green ones looking up at him, and took in the pink, flushed cheeks and the swollen lips straining to wrap themselves around his girth. "You're so fucking beautiful," he whispered in absolute wonder, and flung his head back as his cock swelled and throbbed its agreement. Bodhi pulled off of flung his head back as his cock swelled and throbbed its agreement. Bodhi pulled off, and Red, taking advantage, yanked him up his body. He couldn't wait any longer. "I have to have you. So tell me now if it's not something you're sure about." The right accent and the right voice, but it's still a little creepy. Yanked him up his body. He couldn't wait any longer. "I have to have you. So tell me now if it's not something you're sure about." Red watched as Bodhi licked those sinful lips, pupils dilated, body trembling. "I need you. I don't understand it, but I haven't been complete for as long as I can remember. You give me that." Red shook his head because he couldn't believe he was wanted. "I'm never going to let you go. Just so you understand. You're mine. All mine. Whatever you have to do, I'll be right by your side." He nearly shook Bodhi. "Wherever and whatever that is." Accepting the quick nod as the yes he needed, Red captured Bodhi's lips with his, swirling his tongue and nipping Bodhi's lips. Bodhi trembled so much Red tightened his hold. "Don't let go," Bodhi begged. "Never let me go." Red's wolf howled, a proclamation, a demand, possessive and the ultimate warning, and Red felt the second his wolf urged him to finish it. "I wanted to go slow, but make me yours. I want all of you inside me. I can't hurt." "You won't," Bodhi urged him and drew Red's hand down past his leaking cock until Red could feel the slick that leaked from Bodhi's ass. Red groaned, and his cock throbbed painfully. Red groaned, and his cock throbbed painfully. "That is the sexiest thing I've ever felt. I love that your body wants mine." Bodhi whined, and Red rolled him on his back, pulling his legs wide and bending his head. He had to have a taste, lick up all that cream. Bodhi gasped and cried out as Red used his tongue. "Please, you're killing me," he begged, and Red knelt up and took his leaking cock in his shaky hand. He wasn't sure how long he could last himself. He tried to be gentle, but Bodhi didn't stop begging and cried out as Red breached his entrance. Red held still, even as Bodhi clamped that delicious wet heat all around him. "Move," Bodhi pleaded, and Red's wolf roared in his head. The demand was right to Bodhi's alpha and impossible to ignore. One thrust, and Red was in heaven. But Bodhi didn't give him a chance to pause, dragging him down as lips met lips, biting, sucking, claiming every part of him. He broke off and pulled back slightly before ramming home again. Heat rushed through his insides like molten lava looking for an escape. Bodhi clutched at him, his gasps and shudders mindless and incoherent, and then both animals and humans stilled. Bodhi opened his eyes, and Red stared into amazing golden depths. From somewhere, he heard a roar. Then many throats joined the tumultuous noise. Bodhi arched upwards as if he was unable to control his body. Red's cock swelled, and Bodhi cried out, another orgasm overtaking him in response to Red's not. Red felt his canines lengthen, and Bodhi's arms go around his neck, pulling him down. His teeth sank into his mate as more cum spurted from their bodies. He sucked and sealed the bite, but Bodhi cried out and turned his head the opposite way, an invitation, and Red was helpless not to follow the siren call. Over and over, Bodhi's body begged, and Red responded. Bite after bite decorated his neck, shoulders, and pecs until Red slumped, utterly exhausted, and crushing his mate, unable to move until he softened. They were mates. But whatever else had just happened, Bodhi had just become his life, and there was nothing he wouldn't do to keep him.